Conceiving of the enemy in terms of a dated paradigm cost interwar anti-fascists dearly. That's a quotation from Mark Bray's book, The Anti-Fascist Handbook. Can one be a part of the contemporary GOP without being a Bunker Boy acolyte? I have mixed feelings about absolving Bunker Boy's voters, even when they have now become Lincoln Project people. There was, after all, clear evidence for years before he was elected by the Electoral College that the man was a racist, a shyster, and a creep. And even if you hated Hillary, which is a position I understand, you had the choice to vote third party. Additionally, I highly recommend the Tuning Out the News segment with the notorious grifter neocon, Lincoln Project leader Rick Wilson. I do like some Lincoln Project videos a lot, and I commend the Republicans Against Trump people who are making their testimonials on YouTube or other social media platforms. I don't, however, think the party is worth saving, or that it is worthwhile even as an opposition party for the future. The neoliberal establishment Democratic National Committee is already a center-right political party. Let's see it move left to become a left party, and then let's have an opposition further leftist party to keep them in check. I don't see why anyone would need any further evidence than the mess of the current state of the US after the Republicans had the trifecta of the executive branch and the two branches of the bicameral legislature from 2016 to 2018, and then continued to have the executive branch and the more powerful, by power per person, branch from 2018 until now. In other words, scoreboard. But I don't want to be cynical and argue in bad faith, as those are what I accuse right-wing people and politicians of doing in general. Thus, I'm going to evaluate, are there actually any Republicans in the public sphere who are worth a damn? I thought about calling this vid my 5 favorite Republicans, but obviously those would be members of my family, whom I love. I struggled to come up with 5. The first 3 people I'm actually going to talk about are people I've been familiar with for years, whom I admire for various reasons. And the final 2 are people I have only recently found out about, whom I don't necessarily agree with, but who I definitely think that Republicans should listen to if they do want to have a party that's going to survive into the future. And to be honest, after my family and my I think 3 friends who are Republicans, my other favorite Republicans are anyone out there who's into animal rescue. And if that applies to you, please go watch my video I did on Bunker Boy and dogs and let me know what you think. I'm thinking about people like, these aren't Americans, but there's these animal rescue people who run an organization called The Shire, which I think is up in Canada. And they're like QAnon people. They're pretty out there, but I feel like I can, I won't look down on someone's politics too much. If I won't pretend to understand them, but I won't look down on them too much if they're doing animal rescue work, because to me, actions speak louder than words. All right, number 1, the novelist Mark Helprin, born 1947. First off, please don't get confused and think I'm speaking about the creep Mark Halperin with an A, who was born in 1965, who wrote Game Change. Mark Helprin, with an E, the novelist, I admire because Winter's Tale is one of my favorite books of all time and an all-time great American fantasy novel. I have not read Helprin's other books, so I can't speak to them. Winter's Tale is not a high fantasy, but it is not magical realism either. It has definite fantastical elements mixed with historical fiction, set in the early 20th century New York City and in upstate New York. I'd particularly recommend it to adult or precocious young adult Harry Potter fans, or to fantasy fans who enjoyed Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, for example, or who just like that dead rabbit aesthetic. Also, if you're open to fantasy and you liked Devil in the White City, you'll probably take to Winter's Tale. And there's also like a heavy element of linguistics and like sort of, you know, meta writing about journalism, about storytelling. Don't watch the movie. It's awful. Akiva Goldsman, you suck. I'd say that Helprin's politics don't really factor into Winter's Tale, except for an implicit and like thematic endorsement of a sort of like pure capitalism, for lack of a better term. This idea is that you can organize a for-profit newspaper the same way some 18th century whaling ships were organized. Every worker has a certain amount of shares in the company and can earn more shares, which dilutes the share pool while overall profits rise as the company expands. So it's like a meritocracy. It's a nice idea, profit sharing, employee ownership, used by companies like Helprin Brewing in Massachusetts, for example. But this idea is distinctly different from day traders and them having their own separate economy, which is unaffected and uninterested in Main Street's economy. All right, number 2, Mike Nelson, the host of Mystery Science Theater 3000, the second host of Mystery Science Theater, and the co-host of the contemporary great podcast 372 Pages We'll Never Get Back, which lampoons poorly written genre fiction. Nelson's Wikipedia page identifies him as a Weekly Standard, National Review conservative Republican. He makes brief references to his church-going throughout episodes of 372 Pages. He likes coffee, alcohol, and spicy food, so he is clearly more of a Jack Donaghy than he is a Kenneth Parcell. Kenneth, of course, would not drink hot beverages as that's the devil's temperature. He also, Mike Nelson, also likes Van Morrison, C.S. Lewis, and P.G. Wodehouse, but does not care particularly for Christopher Nolan movies or superhero movies in general. Naturally, his place outside the broad comic book, sci-fi, monolithic fandom, if we can conveniently posit such a thing exists, his place outside of that makes him good at poking fun at it. In other words, someone within the broad sci-fi comic book fandom would have to add qualifiers to many of their critiques. Nelson, coming from a stand-up, improv, TV writing background, is great at being an equal opportunity, humorous critic, roaster. I know that some people prefer Joel to Mike regarding MST3K, but though I've gone back and watched and enjoyed many Joel episodes, Mike is my MST3K host, the one I grew up with in the pre-streaming era. Mine in the same way I prefer Star Trek Next Gen to the original series. Number 3 is David Brooks, the Canadian-American New York Times opinion writer. While I think that Nathan J. Robinson, editor of Current Affairs magazine, makes a great point when he says, in response to the idea that the New York Times should publish pieces like Tom Cotton's recent piece, quote, "Yes, fire all the conservatives on the Times op-ed board. They will immediately snap up jobs at the Heritage Foundation and National Review. Let Stevens, Weiss, Brooks, Dudat speak from those places and turn the New York Times into a paper with clear values. You can have an anti-racist, socialist, feminist newspaper, and it can be fair and committed to truth. It does not need to publish right-wingers as long as it covers them scrupulously, doesn't misrepresent them, and quotes their arguments fairly. This is what the New York Times ought to be." End quote. So while I agree with that sentiment from Robinson, I do feel personally that I've benefited from reading David Brooks' writing overall, and would never have been exposed to it had he been writing for, say, the National Review. Brooks' pieces often seem to be aimed at teens and people in their 20s, warning them about tribalism and encouraging them to foster relationships. By no means is he my favorite columnist at the Times. That would be Nicholas Kristof, with probably Gail Collins being in second place. Brooks was born in Canada, but grew up in Stuyvesant Town, Manhattan, NYC. He was born Jewish, but goes to church now, to a Christian church, if I'm not mistaken. I think I read that in an interview that he did with another publication. I have not read his book, Bobos in Paradise, but find that the idea of bourgeois bohemians is an important one to understand, to give you context about boomers and what they've done to our country and our economy. They gave us $1,000 cell phones with planned obsolescence after 2 years that were made in China, but they also facilitated the American craft beer movement. Brooks says things like, quote, "There's a reason Republicans from Reagan to Bush supported reasonably open immigration policies. They are and have always been good for America," end quote. And, quote, "You can't be a nationalist if you despise diversity. If you don't love diversity, you are not an American nationalist," end quote. Ben Shapiro can't stand Brooks, which is comforting to me. He's called him a faux conservative, and I'd wager he's called him a rhino or a cuckservative, if not on video, then in his private life. It's continually interesting to me the level of projection which occurs in the right wing. Some right-wing people rail that the radical left has taken over the party, the same party which is going to nominate Biden and Harris, while at the same time saying there is no place in the GOP for moderates like Brooks. And Brooks also once said, quote, "Market fundamentalism is an inhumane philosophy that makes economic growth society's prime value and leaves people atomized and unattached," end quote. Number 4 is Saagar Enjeti, who co-hosts a YouTube TV show for The Hill called Rising, along with a woman named Crystal Ball, who is not a Republican. I don't agree with Saagar on much at all. I only discovered Rising, a kind of ersatz hybrid of Crossfire and Morning Joe, a few weeks ago. When Tucker Carlson's head writer's problematic forum postings were uncovered, I must have been clicking through YouTube looking for hot takes on it, and just generally enjoying the schadenfreude of it. I stumbled on Crystal and Saagar discussing it, and immediately dismissed Saagar as a tool based on his inability to condemn Tucker or the writer's words. And I have watched many Rising segments in the week since, and that segment remains a low point for Saagar, who's a Keynesian economic populist with an authoritative xenophobic streak. Saagar recently referred to his corner of the socio-political quadrant graph as the most underrepresented, which makes sense until you remember that most Republicans, and certainly all neocons, are not fiscal conservatives or deficit hawks. They just like to pretend to be while promoting corporate welfare. As I mentioned, I find many of Enjeti's views unpalatable and unconscionable. He buys into the Antifa are evil narrative. He clutches his pearls at talk of further cannabis normalization. Nonetheless, in a if you had to choose situation, I'd take Saagar over presumptive 2024 GOP presidential candidate Tucker every time because of Saagar's candor. Again, I agree with Nathan J. Robinson's analysis of why a right-wing media group like The Hill would host a civil debate type show. He says the idea is to make Saagar's right-wing populism, which includes crypto-fascist rhetoric, seem more mainstream to progressives who tune in for Crystal Ball's analysis. In his own weird way, Saagar is consistent. The show is successful, but not successful enough to make him a millionaire funded by billionaires demagogue like Tucker. Enjeti and Ball host intellectuals like the funky academic and Professor Richard Wolff. Ultimately, I think that Saagar is just a little naive, an accusation which I think fully applies to me as well. He has convictions, and they seem to come from a moral compass, not just a sycophantic, bootlicking money grab. His segment on why Dan Crenshaw calling Republicans the party of Uber is so cringy is satisfying. In another video, he says, quote, "Libertarianism in practice is a selective corporate welfare ideology pushed by the financial industry and big business in Washington to justify all the government subsidies and benefits that prop up the very foundation of their business," end quote. That video is especially worth watching because in it, Ryan Grimm discusses the actual upshot of the Amazon narrative about AOC that Republicans love to push. The Republican narrative is that AOC fighting back against Amazon in Queens, cost all these jobs. The reality is that Amazon was always going to build something in New York. Why should New York taxpayers pay for it? That was the ultimate question. And of course, the Amazon board did not like that. They thought the government should pay for it, the government and the taxpayers. And they're obviously building a new headquarters in the west side of Manhattan as well. So that pushback, it might have cost development in Queens, but they were always going to bring a new headquarters to New York. Ryan Grimm is great in that show. By the way, I didn't know about him. He features on Rising, but he's from, I think it's called The Intercept. So check him out if you are looking for good progressive intellectuals. Enjeti, Ball, and their producers are smart enough to know that while boomers still won't even let a Gen Xer become president, that their time is essentially up. That pivoting to influencing Generation Z is the key to form a lasting voting bloc. Saagar doesn't condemn Ben Shapiro, but is still willing to point out how Shapiro pretty much represents continuing Moscow Mitch's policies, which have failed for 25 years. It's sort of amazing that a line from Saagar like, quote, "The job of the ruling party is to enact actual policy that meets the gravity of the moment," end quote, would seem so out of place in what was once considered a center-right political party. But here we are. Number 5 is someone I only found out about because I was looking for a number 5. And again, someone with whom I don't really agree with about much, but whose work in one area is important enough and anti-GOP establishment enough to warrant interest. Mindy Finn is a digital strategist who worked on W's and Romney's campaigns. Her political action committee and nonprofit Stand Up Republic and the Stand Up Republic Foundation have worked to defeat candidates such as Roy Moore, Devin Nunes, and Steve King. She is an anti-choice feminist, so do with that what you will. She ran for vice president on Evan McMullen's independent 2016 presidential campaign, and she is credited with starting the Never Trump hashtag. The part of her career I'm interested in, however, is her work towards expanding voting. She is the CEO of Citizen Data, whose mission is to empower nonpartisan, cross-partisan, and bipartisan groups with actionable data so they can unite Americans, bridge divides, and advance meaningful change. Stand Up Republic also works on cross-partisan reform to promote the security and integrity of elections. In my limited research on Mindy, I did hear in a podcast from 2017 that after running for VP as an independent, that she did intend to drop her Republican voting registration party affiliation, but not to switch to being a Democrat. So I'm cheating a bit here, and I'll get to a bonus actual registered Republican in a little bit. But I really think it's more that the party left Miss Finn than it is that she left it after some kind of ideological change of belief. She said she simply didn't recognize the party she had grown up with outside Houston once Bunker Boy took its reins. Regarding the 2020 election and the conservative talking point that we are in danger of seeing widespread voter fraud, recently she gave the following remarks, and I'll link to the vid below in which she said this. Quote, "The fraud issue is pretty much a straw man. In recent history, even the president's own election commission to study fraud after 2016 was disbanded after not really finding evidence of it. And the Heritage Foundation also could find very few instances. In the instances where there has been fraud, those obviously do need to be addressed. But if you kind of dig into them, in those cases, it's often the case that it's not voters that are committing fraud, it is bad actors that are looking to manipulate voters, people who are looking to take people's ballots and turn them in for them, which is kind of what happened in North Carolina recently. It was actually a Republican operative that was doing that on behalf of a Republican candidate." End quote. Brianna Keeler, the Australian-born CNN anchor who is their most effective interviewer, in my humble opinion, also brought up some of these same points recently when debating Bunker Boy campaign advisor Mercedes Schlapp. If more Republicans were actually working towards upholding the Voters' Rights Act, then their talk about worrying about mail-in vote fraud would seem more credible. On the contrary, they've worked to undermine the VRA since it was passed. From Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote, which I highly recommend. Quote, "In 1981, with the acquiescence of Reagan's Department of Justice, Alabama purged the voting rolls in 3 counties with sizable black populations and required previously registered voters to go to the courthouse to identify themselves. African American registration dropped by 43%. So yeah, anyone with questions about voter fraud and voter suppression, because it's such a hot topic in the news right now, I recommend watching videos featuring Mindy Finn on YouTube, and definitely read One Person, No Vote by Professor Carol Anderson. Okay, on to the bonus selection to really get my list to 5. Brian Matlock is a young man who recently ran in the Kansas Republican Senate primary and whose platform he calls Republican Socialism. I'll link to his website and to the video from the Vanguard YouTube channel through which I learned about him. He's obviously the kind of Republican I could actually get behind politically. And shout out to the Vanguard. You two guys are doing great work. So I think that if I can come up with 5 right-wing Americans about whom I can say something nice, then I think that the rest of you can too. I'm going to call it the Jar Jar Challenge because of that great line in the Lonely Island's Natalie Rap 2 when she says, "Say something nice about Jar Jar Binks." And because of the irony of me praising someone like Saagar Enjeti, who could be called a crypto-fascist, Jar Jar, after all, was a democratically elected senator who helps grant the emergency powers that Palpatine uses to establish the Empire. So if you haven't deleted your Twitter or Facebook, which I highly recommend deleting those, but if you still have those, go on there and say something nice about 5 people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum, however you define it, from you, and tag it Jar Jar Challenge. And then send me the link. Fortune passes everywhere.